Some men carry their hatred beyond the grave, refusing to let death settle old scores. The stone walls of Altiplano Federal Prison had witnessed countless horrors, but nothing prepared Father Miguel Sandoval for what unfolded during the Christmas charity event of 2019. 200 guests, politicians, journalists, clergy, had gathered in the main courtyard when two figures emerged from the shadows of the East Corridor. Miguel's blood turned to ice as he recognized them: Arturo Beltrán Leyva and Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, standing face to face for the first time in over a decade. The impossible part? Both men had been declared dead years ago. As Beltrán Leyva's voice echoed through the courtyard, publicly shaming his former partner with words that cut deeper than any blade, the entire room fell into an unnatural silence. Then came Chapo's response, 3 words so cold, so final, that even the most hardened criminals stepped back in fear. Miguel, a man who had counseled killers and comforted the damned for 30 years, found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about life, death, and the price of betrayal. What happens when the dead refuse to stay buried, and old vendettas transcend the boundaries between worlds? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Miguel's hands trembled as he clutched his rosary, the familiar weight of the silver cross doing nothing to anchor him in this moment that defied every law of nature he'd spent 5 decades accepting. The courtyard had transformed into something resembling a medieval tableau, 200 souls frozen in collective terror, their Christmas spirit evaporating like morning mist. "You always were a coward, Joaquín," Beltrán Leyva's voice carried with unnatural clarity across the stone expanse, each syllable dripping with the venom of old wounds. "Hiding behind your tunnels, your bribes, your purchased loyalty, but you couldn't hide from what you did to my family." Miguel forced himself to breathe, his seminary training warring with the evidence before his eyes. He had buried Arturo Beltrán Leyva himself. Well, not literally, but he had been present at the memorial service in 2009, had spoken words of reluctant forgiveness over a man whose sins had stained half of Mexico with blood. And Chapo, the entire world had watched his trial, his conviction, his disappearance into the American prison system where he had allegedly died just months ago. Yet here they stood, solid as the prison walls surrounding them, their presence radiating the same menacing charisma that had once commanded armies of sicarios. The gathered politicians and journalists pressed against the far walls, their carefully planned photo opportunity dissolving into a nightmare none of them would ever dare report. Miguel noticed how the shadows seemed to bend around the two figures, how the December air had turned thick with an otherworldly chill that made his breath visible despite the mild evening temperature. "Hiding?" Chapo's laugh was soft, almost conversational, but it carried an undertone that made several hardened inmates actually whimper. "I built an empire while you played at being a soldier. I survived every betrayal, every war, every war except the last one," Beltrán Leyva interrupted, taking a step forward. The movement was fluid, predatory, and Miguel noticed that neither man's feet seemed to make any sound against the concrete. "The one where you sold my coordinates to the Federales. The one where you watched them pump my body full of bullets like I was some street dealer instead of your compadre." Miguel's mind raced through the theological implications. In 30 years of prison ministry, he had counseled men who claimed to see ghosts, who spoke of debts that followed them beyond the grave. He had always attributed such visions to guilt, to psychological trauma, to the human mind's desperate attempt to process unbearable shame. But this was different. 200 witnesses couldn't all be hallucinating the same impossible encounter. The silence stretched taut as a wire, broken only by the distant sound of Christmas carols playing from the prison's PA system, a grotesque soundtrack to this supernatural confrontation. Miguel found himself stepping closer, his pastoral instincts overriding his terror. If these were indeed spirits trapped between worlds, if his faith meant anything at all, perhaps he could— Then Chapo spoke those 3 words, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow audible to every soul in that courtyard. "Check your chest." The effect was immediate and horrifying. Beltrán Leyva's confident posture crumbled as he looked down at himself. His white guayabera began to darken, spreading stains that looked black in the artificial lighting but which Miguel knew with sick certainty were red. The fabric became sodden, clinging to the man's torso as phantom bullets found their marks again and again, replaying his death in slow, methodical detail. Several inmates actually fled, their footsteps echoing off the walls as they scrambled for the exits. The journalists had stopped filming, their cameras forgotten as they witnessed something that would never make it to air, never be believed if they tried to report it. Miguel stood transfixed, watching a man die again, watching wounds that had been inflicted a decade ago assert their eternal claim. "You see, Arturo," Chapo continued, his voice growing softer, more intimate, like a lover's whisper, "death doesn't make us even. It just gives me forever to remind you who won." Beltrán Leyva's form began to waver, the confident specter becoming something pitiful and broken. He opened his mouth to speak, but only blood emerged, the same blood that had pooled beneath his body in that Cuernavaca apartment so many years ago. His eyes, wide with the same shock that had marked his final moments, found Miguel's across the courtyard. In those eyes, the priest saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his days, a plea for forgiveness that came a decade too late, a recognition that some choices echo beyond the grave, and a terrible understanding that hell might not be a place at all, but simply the eternal repetition of our worst moments. As Beltrán Leyva's figure dissolved into shadow, Chapo turned his attention to the crowd of witnesses. His smile was almost gentle, paternal even, but his eyes held the coldness of deep ocean trenches. "Feliz Navidad," he said, and then he too faded into darkness, leaving only the scent of gunpowder and the lingering echo of supernatural malice. Miguel stood alone in a courtyard full of people, questioning everything he thought he knew about redemption. The scent of gunpowder lingered in Miguel's nostrils as he stumbled back to his quarters 3 hours later, his legs moving through muscle memory alone. The official story was already crystallizing around him. A gas leak in the kitchen had caused brief hallucinations, a medical emergency that required immediate evacuation of the Christmas event. The prison officials moved with practiced efficiency, collecting phones, confiscating cameras, scheduling medical evaluations for anyone who might have symptoms from the supposed leak. Miguel watched them work with the detached fascination of a man observing his own funeral. 30 years of ministering to the damned, and he had never seen anything close to what had just transpired. Yet within hours it would be scrubbed from existence, reduced to a footnote in maintenance reports and insurance claims. His small apartment in the chaplain's quarters felt suffocatingly normal after what he had witnessed. The same threadbare crucifix hung above his narrow bed, the same stack of theology books gathered dust on his makeshift desk, the same photograph of his ordination class. Young men with bright eyes and unshakable faith smiled at him from the dresser. That Miguel, the one captured in faded color 35 years ago, would have had explanations for tonight. That Miguel had believed in clean lines between good and evil, between the living and the dead, between salvation and damnation. This Miguel poured himself 3 fingers of contraband whiskey and sat heavily in his reading chair. The bottle had been a gift from Comandante Vasquez, the prison warden who had recruited Miguel 5 years ago when his position at the seminary had become complicated. Vasquez understood that men like Miguel, men who had seen too much and questioned too loudly, needed somewhere to land when their certainties crumbled. The prison had become Miguel's refuge, a place where broken faith felt appropriate, where ministering to the lost suited his own spiritual exile. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister Elena in Guadalajara saw the news about the gas leak. "Are you safe? The children are asking about their tío Miguel." Miguel stared at the message for long minutes. Elena's children, Sofia, 8, and little Carlos, 6, were the closest he would ever come to having a family of his own. Every month he sent them letters filled with carefully edited stories from his work, tales of redemption and second chances that omitted the violence, the despair, the men who died in their cells clutching photos of families they had destroyed. The children believed their uncle was a hero, bringing God's love to forgotten souls. What would he tell them about tonight? How could he explain that their hero had witnessed something that shattered his understanding of divine justice, that he had seen evil so profound it transcended death itself, that forgiveness might not be possible for some sins? He typed back, "I'm fine, just tired. Kiss the children for me." Another text arrived almost immediately, this one from Dr. Esperanza Rivera, the prison psychologist who had become his closest friend at Altiplano. Her message was more direct. "That wasn't a gas leak. I need to see you. My office tomorrow at dawn, before the official interviews begin." Miguel deleted both messages and turned off the phone. Esperanza was dangerous, too smart, too perceptive, too willing to dig beneath convenient explanations. She had been the one to notice patterns in his reports, similarities between his accounts of different inmates' spiritual crises that suggested something deeper than individual trauma. If anyone could piece together the true nature of what had happened tonight, it would be her. The whiskey burned as it went down, but it failed to chase away the memory of Beltrán Leyva's eyes in those final moments, not the supernatural specter, but the human recognition of eternal consequence. Miguel had spent decades offering comfort to dying men, assuring them that sincere repentance could wash away any sin. It was the foundation of his faith, the cornerstone of his entire worldview. But what if he had been wrong? What if some choices carved themselves so deeply into a soul that not even death could erase them? What if the mercy he preached was just another beautiful lie, told to make unbearable truths palatable? Outside his window, Altiplano Federal Prison continued its nighttime rhythm. Guards walked their rounds, inmates settled into restless sleep, and somewhere in the administrative offices, bureaucrats worked to ensure that tonight's events never officially existed. By morning, there would be medical explanations, psychological evaluations, and carefully crafted reports that reduced the supernatural to mundane malfunction. Miguel envied them their certainty, their ability to file away the impossible under convenient categories. He had lost that luxury the moment he looked into the eyes of the damned and realized they were looking back from beyond the grave. Tomorrow would bring questions he wasn't prepared to answer, interviews he couldn't navigate without lying, and the growing certainty that his carefully constructed refuge at Altiplano was about to collapse around him. But tonight, he sat in his chair and wondered if redemption was just another ghost story, beautiful, comforting, and ultimately false. The whiskey bottle grew lighter as the questions grew heavier, and Father Miguel Sandoval prepared to lose everything he had left to lose. Dawn came too early and brought no absolution. Miguel woke slumped in his reading chair, neck cramped and mouth dry as parchment. The whiskey bottle lay empty at his feet like an accusation. Outside his window, Altiplano stirred to life with its usual mechanical precision, guards changing shifts, inmates shuffling to breakfast, the great concrete organism resuming its daily cycle of containment and control. For a moment, blessed amnesia let him believe the previous night had been nothing more than alcohol-fueled nightmare. Then he caught the faint scent of gunpowder still clinging to his cassock, and reality crashed back with crushing force. His phone buzzed insistently. 7 missed calls from Dr. Rivera, 3 from Warden Vasquez, and a text message marked urgent from a number he didn't recognize. "Father Sandoval, we need to talk. Garden behind the chapel. Come alone. Ma." Ma, the initials, meant nothing to him, but something about the message made his hands tremble as he deleted it. The sender somehow knew exactly where to find him, exactly how to reach him without going through official channels. In a maximum security prison where every communication was monitored, where visitors were vetted months in advance, this anonymous contact felt like a violation of the natural order, much like everything else that had happened in the past 12 hours. Miguel showered and dressed with mechanical precision, avoiding his reflection in the small bathroom mirror. Whatever looked back at him now wasn't the same man who had entered that courtyard yesterday. That man had possessed unshakable faith in divine mercy. This stranger wearing his face had seen mercy's limitations written in supernatural blood. The corridor outside his quarters buzzed with unusual activity. Prison officials in expensive suits huddled in whispered conversations, their clipboards thick with incident reports and legal documents. Miguel recognized the type. Damage control specialists, the bureaucratic magicians who transformed inconvenient truths into acceptable fiction. "Padre Miguel!" A familiar voice called from behind him. He turned to see Lieutenant Garcia approaching, the young guard who often attended Miguel's weekly Bible study sessions. Garcia's usual easy smile was absent, replaced by the haunted expression of someone grappling with impossible memory. "Lieutenant, good morning," Miguel managed. That gas leak last night. Garcia stepped closer, lowering his voice. Padre, I've worked industrial sites before my time here. I know what gas exposure feels like, smells like. What we experienced... He paused, glancing around nervously. That wasn't gas. Miguel felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. Here was a young man seeking truth, looking to his chaplain for guidance and clarity. The pastoral response would be to offer comfort, to support the official narrative that would let Garcia sleep peacefully in his ignorance. Instead, Miguel found himself studying Garcia's face, measuring the strength beneath the confusion. What do you think it was? I don't know, Padre. But I saw things that shouldn't be possible. And from the way the officials are acting, cleaning up, making calls... Garcia's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I think we all saw the same impossible thing. Before Miguel could respond, Dr. Rivera appeared at the end of the corridor, her expression urgent. She caught sight of Miguel and Garcia together and approached with the quick, decisive stride of someone accustomed to managing crises. Father Sandoval, Lieutenant Garcia, she nodded professionally. I believe you both have appointments for psychological evaluation this morning. Standard protocol after exposure incidents. The words were perfectly normal, but Miguel caught the warning in her tone. Garcia straightened, his training asserting itself. Of course, doctor. I was just... Lieutenant, Rivera interrupted gently. Perhaps you could give Father Sandoval and myself a moment? Professional consultation regarding the spiritual welfare of affected personnel. Garcia nodded and retreated, but not before giving Miguel a look that clearly said their conversation was far from over. The young guard's faith had been shaken, and he would continue seeking answers whether Miguel provided them or not. Walk with me, Rivera said once Garcia was out of earshot. They moved through the prison corridors in silence until they reached the small garden behind the chapel, the same location mentioned in the mysterious text message. The coincidence sent ice water through Miguel's veins. Esperanza, I received a message. From M.A., she finished. Yes, so did I. Miguel stopped walking. You know who? I know that we witnessed something last night that has no rational explanation. I know that powerful people are working very hard to erase it from existence, and I know that we have a choice to make. Rivera pulled a thick manila folder from her briefcase. 3 years ago, I started noticing patterns in the psychological profiles of certain inmates. Men who claimed to have encounters with deceased cartel leaders, who described supernatural experiences with remarkable consistency. I documented everything, kept copies of reports that were later lost or misfiled. She opened the folder, revealing photographs, interview transcripts, and medical records. Father Miguel, what we saw last night wasn't an isolated incident. It's been happening for years, but always to individuals, always explained away as trauma or psychosis. Last night was different because it had witnesses, too many to silence easily. Miguel stared at the evidence before him, feeling the last foundations of his ordinary world crumbling away. What are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to help me find the truth about what's really happening in this prison, about who Ma is, about why the dead seem unable to rest. Rivera's eyes held the same desperate hunger for answers that Miguel recognized in his own reflection. But I need to warn you, once we start down this path, there's no going back, no more comfortable ignorance, no more simple faith. From somewhere in the garden came the soft sound of footsteps on gravel. Miguel looked up to see a figure approaching through the morning shadows, someone who shouldn't exist, someone whose very presence would change everything. The choice was no longer whether to seek answers. The choice was whether he was strong enough to survive finding them. The figure emerged from the shadows like a memory made flesh, an elderly man in an immaculate three-piece suit, his silver hair perfectly combed despite the early hour. Miguel's breath caught in his throat as recognition dawned. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, dead for over 20 years. Miguel grabbed Rivera's arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of her blazer. We need to leave, now. But Rivera stood transfixed, her scientific mind warring with the impossible evidence before her eyes. This is exactly what I've been documenting, she whispered. The consistency of the manifestations, the detail, the esperanza. Miguel's voice cracked like breaking glass. "That man has been dead since 1997. Carrillo approached with unhurried steps, his presence radiating the same casual authority that had once commanded billion-dollar drug empires. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of earth and time. "Father Sandoval, Dr. Rivera, please don't let my condition alarm you. We have much to discuss." Miguel felt his carefully maintained composure shatter completely. The previous night, he had witnessed something terrible but distant, a confrontation between monsters whose evil he could catalog and condemn. This was different. This was personal contact with the impossible, a direct challenge to every natural law he had accepted since childhood. "This isn't real," he stammered, backing toward the chapel door. "This is trauma, hallucination, some kind of psychological break from last night." "Father." Carrillo's tone held patient disappointment, like a teacher correcting a slow student. "You've spent 30 years ministering to men like me. Did you really believe death would provide such simple escape from our choices?" The question hit Miguel like a physical blow. How many times had he offered that exact comfort to dying inmates? How many last rites had he performed while whispering promises about divine mercy washing away earthly sins? The foundation of his entire ministry rested on the assumption that death offered redemption, that genuine repentance could overcome any transgression. But standing before this specter of unrepentant evil, Miguel felt those certainties crumble into dust. Rivera stepped forward, her clinical instincts overriding her fear. "You're Ma Amato. But why contact us? What do you want?" Carrillo smiled with the indulgent warmth of a beloved grandfather, an expression that made Miguel's skin crawl. "I want to offer you the truth, Doctor. The truth about this place, about what happens to men like me when the world believes we've found peace in death." His eyes shifted to Miguel. "The truth about whether redemption is possible for sins that reshape the very fabric of reality." Miguel's legs felt weak. Everything he had built his life upon, his faith, his calling, his understanding of divine justice, was being systematically destroyed by forces beyond his comprehension. The comfortable theology of forgiveness and second chances couldn't accommodate the supernatural persistence of evil standing before him. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't be part of this, whatever this is." "You already are part of it, Father," Carrillo replied gently. "The moment you witnessed last night's reunion between old friends, you became entangled in something much larger than yourself. The only question now is whether you'll seek understanding or remain willfully blind." Miguel thought of his sister Elena, of little Sofia and Carlos with their innocent faith in their heroic uncle. He thought of Lieutenant Garcia and the other guards who looked to him for spiritual guidance. He thought of the hundreds of inmates who confessed their sins to him, seeking absolution he was no longer certain he could provide. If we help you," Miguel's voice barely rose above a whisper, "what happens to everything else? My ministry, my faith, my ability to offer hope to the living?" Carrillo's expression grew almost compassionate. "That depends entirely on what you discover, Father. Some truths liberate. Others destroy everything we thought we knew." He gestured toward the manila folder in Rivera's hands. "But ignorance is no longer an option. Too many people saw too much last night. The dam has broken." Rivera opened her folder, pulling out a photograph that made Miguel's blood freeze. It showed the Christmas event courtyard, taken from a security camera angle he hadn't noticed. In the image, two translucent figures stood exactly where Chapo and Beltrán Leyva had manifested, their forms clearly visible against the crowd of terrified witnesses. "This is one of 17 photographs from last night," Rivera said quietly. "Each one shows the same impossible thing. Physical proof that cannot be explained away or buried in bureaucratic files." Miguel stared at the evidence, feeling the last of his resistance crumble. The comfortable world of explicable evil and available redemption was gone, replaced by something far more complex and terrifying. He could retreat to his quarters, request a transfer, return to the simple certainties of civilian ministry. But he would carry this knowledge forever, would see supernatural malice lurking behind every confession, every prayer for forgiveness. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" he heard himself say. Carrillo's smile widened, revealing teeth that gleamed like polished bone in the morning light. "I'm asking you to descend into hell, Father, and I'm offering to be your guide." Miguel stared at Carrillo's outstretched hand, perfectly manicured despite decades of death, and felt the last threads of his old life unraveling. The morning air carried the scent of jasmine from the prison garden, incongruously beautiful against the backdrop of supernatural horror. Behind him lay everything familiar: his quarters, his books, his carefully ordered understanding of good and evil, ahead stretched an abyss of impossible truth. "I need guarantees," Miguel said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Protection for the guards who witnessed this, for Dr. Rivera, for anyone else who gets pulled into this investigation." Carrillo lowered his hand but nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. "You negotiate terms with the dead, Father. Interesting. Yes, certain protections can be arranged. My influence extends beyond the grave in ways that might surprise you." Rivera clutched her folder tighter. "What exactly are we agreeing to investigate? What happened last night was just the beginning, wasn't it?" "Altiplano isn't just a prison, Doctor," Carrillo replied. "It's a nexus, a place where the boundaries between life and death have grown permeable. The men who built their empires on blood and fear don't simply fade away when their bodies fail. We remain bound to the scenes of our greatest triumphs and darkest choices." Miguel felt his theological training reassert itself despite the circumstances. "But why here? Why this place specifically?" "Because this is where they brought us all eventually." Carrillo's voice carried bitter amusement. "El Chapo, the Beltrán Leyva brothers, dozens of others. They thought these walls could contain what we had become. They were wrong. Death is just another form of imprisonment, Father, and we've always been very good at escape." The implications crashed over Miguel like a physical weight. If Carrillo was telling the truth, then Altiplano wasn't a rehabilitation facility or even a simple prison. It was a supernatural battlefield where the living and dead continued ancient wars. Every inmate he had counseled, every confession he had heard, every prayer he had offered had taken place in the shadow of something far darker than he had ever imagined. "The other manifestations Rivera documented," Miguel said slowly. "How many entities are we talking about?" "Dozens," Rivera answered before Carrillo could respond. "I have reports going back 3 years, inmates claiming to receive orders from deceased cartel leaders, guards reporting impossible encounters during night shifts. Even some of the administrative staff have filed complaints about supernatural harassment that were immediately buried." Miguel thought of Lieutenant Garcia's haunted expression, of the young man's desperate need for answers. How many others were struggling with similar impossible memories? How many were questioning their own sanity because the official narrative demanded they deny what they had witnessed? "There's something else," Carrillo continued, his tone growing more serious. "The manifestations are becoming stronger, more frequent. What you witnessed last night, that level of physical interaction with the living world, that's new. We're growing more powerful, more capable of affecting the material realm." "Why?" Rivera asked. "What's changed?" Carrillo's smile faded entirely. "That, Doctor, is what we need to discover together. Someone or something is feeding us energy, allowing us to maintain coherent consciousness beyond death, and I believe they have plans that extend far beyond this prison's walls." Miguel felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. Everything rational screamed at him to run, to request immediate transfer, to pretend none of this was happening. But the photographs in Rivera's folder made denial impossible. More importantly, the spiritual crisis spreading through Altiplano's staff and inmates was real, regardless of its supernatural cause. People were suffering, questioning their faith and sanity. They needed guidance he couldn't provide while hiding from the truth. "If we do this," Miguel said carefully, "if we help you investigate, what's the end game? What happens when we find answers?" "That depends entirely on what we discover, Father. Perhaps we find a way to put the dead properly to rest. Perhaps we uncover a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of government. Or perhaps," Carrillo paused, his expression growing distant, "perhaps we learn that some forms of evil are too profound to ever find peace, in this world or any other." Miguel looked at Rivera, seeing his own fear and determination reflected in her eyes. She had spent years documenting the impossible, had risked her career to preserve evidence that others wanted buried. She was already committed to this path whether he joined her or not. The thought of abandoning her to face this alone decided him. "God help us," Miguel whispered, then louder, "What do you need us to do?" Carrillo's smile returned, cold and satisfied. "First, we need to access the restricted files in Warden Vasquez's office. The real files, not the sanitized versions they show visiting inspectors. Then we need to map the manifestation patterns, identify which of the current inmates might be in contact with deceased leaders." Miguel felt the last of his comfortable certainties slip away like water through his fingers. There would be no returning to simple faith, no retreat into ignorant blessing. He had crossed a threshold into supernatural darkness, and the only way forward was deeper into the mystery. The morning sun climbed higher over Altiplano Federal Prison, but for Father Miguel Sandoval, true darkness was just beginning. The sound of approaching footsteps shattered the uneasy alliance before it could fully form. Miguel spun toward the chapel entrance, his heart hammering against his ribs as three figures emerged from the morning shadows. But these were flesh and blood, not supernatural manifestations. Warden Vasquez led the group, his usually immaculate uniform wrinkled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. Behind him walked two men Miguel didn't recognize, one in an expensive suit that screamed federal authority, the other wearing the kind of casual clothes that somehow made him more threatening than any uniform. Carrillo's form flickered like a television losing signal, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "The files, Father Vasquez's office, tonight after midnight shift change." Then he dissolved completely, leaving only the faint scent of expensive cologne and something that might have been grave earth. Miguel grabbed Rivera's folder, shoving it inside his jacket as the warden approached. The photographs of supernatural manifestations pressed against his ribs like accusatory fingers. "Father Sandoval, Dr. Rivera." Vasquez's voice carried the brittle politeness of a man barely maintaining control. "Gentlemen, allow me to introduce Agent Morales from the Federal Investigation Agency and Mr. Delgado from the Ministry of Interior." Agent Morales stepped forward with the predatory grace of a career investigator. His eyes swept over Miguel and Rivera with uncomfortable intensity, as if he could read their guilty knowledge in their posture. "Father, Doctor, we're conducting follow-up interviews regarding last night's incident. We understand you both had excellent vantage points during the disturbance." Miguel felt Rivera tense beside him. The folder's contents seemed to burn through his jacket, physical evidence of impossible truths that these men would kill to suppress. "Of course, Agent Morales, though I'm not sure how helpful our testimony will be. The lighting was poor, emotions were running high." "Interesting." Delgado spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the soft menace of bureaucratic power. "Because we have reports suggesting the disturbance involved unusual elements. Psychological manipulation, perhaps mass hysteria triggered by carefully orchestrated performance art." Rivera found her voice. "Performance art? Holographic projection, perhaps. Sound systems hidden throughout the courtyard. Technology has become quite sophisticated." Morales pulled out a tablet, showing security footage from the previous night. "We've identified several inconsistencies in the recorded data that support this theory." Miguel stared at the screen. The timestamp showed the exact moment of the confrontation between Chapo and Beltrán Leyva, but the image revealed only an empty courtyard filled with panicking witnesses. No ghostly figures, no supernatural manifestation, just terrified people reacting to nothing visible. "The recordings have been altered," Rivera whispered, too quiet for the officials to hear. But Morales caught it anyway. "Doctor, you seem to have strong opinions about our investigation. Perhaps you'd be willing to share any additional evidence you might have collected?" The question landed like a trap snapping shut. Miguel realized with crystalline clarity that this wasn't a routine follow-up interview. It was a fishing expedition. These men knew that witnesses had potentially gathered proof of supernatural activity, and they were here to confiscate or destroy it. "Dr. Rivera has been helping me counsel the guards who witnessed the disturbance," Miguel said, stepping slightly in front of her. "Their spiritual welfare is my responsibility. Any discussions we've had fall under pastoral confidentiality. Delgado's smile was thin as a razor blade. Of course, Father. Though I should mention that national security concerns can sometimes override even religious protocols if evidence of terrorist activity or threats to public order were discovered. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Miguel understood perfectly: cooperate completely, or face charges that would strip away all legal protections. His ministry, his ability to help anyone, would become collateral damage in their cover-up operation. Perhaps, Warden Vasquez interjected diplomatically, we could schedule formal interviews for this afternoon? Allow everyone to prepare properly? Actually, Morales said, his attention fixing on Rivera's briefcase with laser intensity, I'd prefer to conduct a preliminary review now. Doctor, if you wouldn't mind sharing any notes or observations you've made? Miguel felt the moment crystallizing around them like ice. Rivera's years of documentation, the photographs proving supernatural activity, Carrillo's promised alliance, everything balanced on the edge of discovery and destruction. One wrong word, one visible sign of the folder hidden beneath his jacket, and their investigation would end before it truly began. But as he met Rivera's eyes, Miguel saw something that hadn't been there before: steel determination replacing scientific curiosity. She had made her choice in the few moments since the officials arrived. Of course, Agent Morales, Rivera said with perfect professional composure, though I'm afraid my preliminary notes are rather sparse. Mostly psychological profiles of affected personnel, standard trauma response protocols, nothing that would interest federal investigators. She opened her briefcase with theatrical cooperation, revealing only standard medical forms and psychological evaluation templates. The real evidence, the photographs, the interview transcripts, the documented patterns of supernatural activity, had somehow vanished. Miguel realized she had been preparing for this moment for years, had built multiple layers of protection around her impossible research. The folder he carried might be only one copy among many, hidden throughout the prison in places these agents would never think to search. The rules of their new world were becoming clear. Trust no one in authority, assume all communications were monitored, and always maintain plausible deniability. They were no longer investigators seeking truth. They were conspirators hiding from it. Agent Morales studied Rivera's briefcase contents with the methodical precision of a man who had built his career on finding what others tried to hide. His fingers moved through the psychological evaluation forms like a pianist testing unfamiliar keys, searching for the false note that would reveal deception. Standard protocols, he murmured, lifting a trauma response checklist toward the light. And yet, Doctor, we have reports of guards claiming they witnessed impossible phenomena. Surely such extreme psychological breaks would merit more detailed documentation. Miguel felt sweat gathering beneath his collar despite the morning chill. The folder pressed against his ribs seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, each photograph a potential death sentence for their nascent investigation. He watched Rivera's face, marveling at her composure while terror clawed at his own throat. Mass hysteria events often produce remarkably consistent delusions among witnesses, Rivera replied with clinical detachment. The human mind abhors inexplicable chaos. When confronted with violence in poorly lit conditions, witnesses frequently construct elaborate explanations that feel more psychologically acceptable than random brutality. Delgado stepped closer, his bureaucratic smile never wavering. So you're saying the guards invented supernatural elements to cope with what they witnessed? I'm saying traumatized individuals often create shared narratives that help them process collective shock. It's well documented in psychiatric literature. Miguel recognized the brilliance of her strategy. She was using legitimate psychological theory to explain away the supernatural evidence, while simultaneously establishing plausible reasons for any lingering inconsistencies in witness testimony. But he also saw the dangerous game they were playing. One slip, one contradictory detail, and these men would tear apart everything they had worked to protect. Fascinating, Morales said, though his tone suggested anything but academic interest. And you, Father Sandoval? How do you reconcile your spiritual calling with such clinical explanations of your parishioners' experiences? The question struck like a physical blow. Miguel felt the weight of genuine theological crisis beneath the immediate tactical challenge. How could he minister to people experiencing supernatural persecution while publicly denying its reality? How could he offer spiritual guidance when he was actively conspiring to hide divine evidence from secular authorities? Faith and psychology often address different aspects of human suffering, Miguel said carefully. My role is to help people find peace and purpose regardless of the specific mechanisms underlying their distress. Whether someone believes they encountered the supernatural or recognizes their experience as trauma-induced hallucination, their need for spiritual support remains equally valid. Warden Vasquez shifted uncomfortably. Miguel noticed fresh worry lines around the man's eyes, the telltale signs of someone caught between competing pressures. The warden knew what really happened last night, had probably witnessed supernatural activity himself, but was being forced to participate in an official cover-up that made him complicit in denying reality. Well, Delgado said, snapping his tablet closed with bureaucratic finality, I believe we have sufficient preliminary information. We'll need to schedule formal interviews with all primary witnesses, review additional security footage, and conduct a thorough assessment of the facility's psychological support protocols. Of course, Miguel replied, though I should mention that many of the guards are still quite shaken, perhaps allowing a few days for emotional stabilization before formal questioning. Morales's smile held all the warmth of winter steel. I'm afraid national security concerns don't allow for extended delays, Father. We'll begin comprehensive interviews tomorrow morning. I trust you'll encourage full cooperation from all personnel under your pastoral care. The threat was unmistakable. Miguel understood that any attempt to coach witnesses or prepare them for questioning would be interpreted as obstruction of justice. Yet abandoning the guards to face interrogation without warning felt like betraying his spiritual responsibilities. I'll certainly emphasize the importance of honesty and cooperation, Miguel said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. As the officials prepared to leave, Rivera closed her briefcase with deliberate calm. Gentlemen, if you need any additional psychological assessments or trauma counseling protocols, I'm at your disposal. The welfare of Altiplano's personnel is my primary concern. After the men departed, Miguel and Rivera stood in silence for several long moments. The chapel felt different now. No longer a sanctuary, but a staging area for clandestine operations that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. They know, Rivera said quietly. They know something supernatural is happening here, and they're actively working to suppress evidence. Miguel nodded, feeling the folder's weight shift against his ribs. Which means Carrillo was right. This goes far beyond prison walls. Someone with significant government connections has been covering up supernatural activity for years. Tonight, Rivera whispered, Vasquez's office. If we're going to find answers before they shut us down completely, it has to be tonight. Miguel thought of Lieutenant Garcia and the other guards who would face interrogation tomorrow, their sanity and careers hanging in the balance. He thought of his sister Elena, who still believed her brother was a simple prison chaplain bringing comfort to the lost. Most of all, he thought of the supernatural entities growing stronger within these walls, feeding on unknown energy sources, while government officials helped conceal their existence. They were no longer just investigating impossible phenomena. They were racing against time to prevent something far worse from awakening in the darkness. The hours crawled toward midnight with excruciating slowness. Miguel sat in his sparse quarters, staring at the folder that could destroy everything he had built over 20 years of ministry. The photographs seemed to whisper accusations from within their Manila prison, evidence of divine intervention in a world that demanded scientific explanations, proof of supernatural justice in a system built on secular law. His hands trembled as he opened to the clearest image, Arturo Beltrán Leyva's ghostly form towering over the cowering figure of El Chapo, both men radiating an otherworldly malevolence that the camera had somehow captured despite their ethereal nature. Every rational fiber of his being screamed that this was impossible, a trick of light and shadow and desperate imagination, but he had seen their eyes, had felt the temperature drop when they materialized, had watched hardened criminals flee in terror from something that transcended earthly understanding of power and vengeance. A soft knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Rivera slipped through the door like a shadow, her medical bag replaced by a compact toolkit that suggested skills far beyond psychological counseling. "The night shift supervisor is Lieutenant Moreno," she whispered. "He's sympathetic, lost 2 brothers to cartel violence. He'll give us 30 minutes in Vasquez's office, but after that, we're on our own." Miguel's throat felt lined with sandpaper. "What exactly are we looking for?" Carrillo mentioned restricted files, records they don't show inspectors. Rivera's eyes held a determination that both inspired and terrified him. Death records, transfer documents, anything that might explain how deceased cartel leaders are manifesting with increasing physical presence. They moved through corridors that felt alien in the darkness, past cells containing men whose crimes had shaped Mexico's bloody recent history. Miguel found himself wondering how many of these inmates were in communication with dead associates, how many supernatural conferences were conducted in whispers between midnight and dawn. Lieutenant Moreno waited by the administrative wing entrance, his young face etched with premature lines of stress and grief. 15 minutes past midnight, the cameras cycled to backup mode for routine maintenance, he said without preamble. "That gives you a 28-minute window. After that, I can't help you." Miguel felt his last opportunity for retreat evaporating. Once they entered Vasquez's office, once they accessed classified files, they would cross from passive observation into active conspiracy against federal authorities. There would be no explaining their presence, no claiming innocent curiosity. "Lieutenant," Miguel said quietly, "what you witnessed last night, do you believe it was real?" Moreno's laugh held no humor. "Father, my brothers died fighting ghosts made flesh, sicarios who should have been in morgues, cartel leaders who kept issuing orders months after their supposed deaths. Real doesn't matter anymore. What matters is survival." They reached the warden's office as the security cameras blinked from active red to dormant amber. Rivera produced a collection of small tools that definitely weren't standard medical equipment, working the electronic lock with practiced efficiency that raised uncomfortable questions about her past. The office felt like a shrine to institutional authority. Diplomas, commendations, photographs with various government officials, all arranged to project competence and integrity. But Rivera moved directly to the filing cabinets behind the desk, her tools finding purchase in locks that were supposed to be impregnable. "Here," she breathed, pulling out a thick folder marked with federal classification codes that made Miguel's blood freeze. "Supernatural Activity Suppression Protocol. Altiplano Implementation Guidelines." Miguel's faith in governmental rationality collapsed entirely as Rivera spread the documents across Vasquez's desk. Page after page detailed official procedures for documenting, concealing, and managing supernatural manifestations within federal facilities. There were psychological evaluation forms specifically designed to discredit witnesses, media suppression protocols, and most chilling of all, authorization procedures for eliminating personnel whose testimony could compromise national security. "My God," Miguel whispered, reading a memorandum dated 3 months earlier. "They're not just covering up supernatural activity, they're facilitating it." Rivera's face had gone pale in the desk lamp's glow. "Look at this transfer log. Inmates with documented supernatural contacts are being relocated to specific facilities across the country. They're not trying to stop the manifestations. They're studying them, controlling them." The implications crashed over Miguel like a tsunami of revelation. The government wasn't fighting supernatural infiltration of the prison system, they were weaponizing it, turning ghostly vengeance into a tool of social control. Dead cartel leaders weren't returning randomly. They were being summoned, directed, used to terrorize and manipulate the living. A sound in the outer corridor froze them both. Footsteps, moving with purpose toward the administrative wing. Someone was coming, and they were still surrounded by evidence that would guarantee their immediate elimination as threats to national security. Miguel realized with crystalline terror that they had walked directly into a trap, that their investigation had been monitored and guided from the beginning. The ordeal wasn't just beginning, it had been orchestrated specifically for them. The footsteps stopped directly outside the office door. Miguel's heart hammered against his ribs as Rivera frantically gathered the scattered documents, her hands shaking for the first time since he'd known her. The classified folders seemed to multiply in the lamplight, evidence of governmental conspiracy spreading across the warden's desk like accusations of treason. A key turned in the outer lock. The window, Rivera hissed, but Miguel knew they were 3 stories up with nowhere to run. The footsteps resumed, closer now, accompanied by the low murmur of voices discussing security protocols and containment procedures. Miguel grabbed the nearest document, a transfer authorization for inmates with Level 4 supernatural contact, and shoved it inside his jacket alongside the original photographs. Rivera was still scrambling to return files to their proper folders when the office door handle began to turn. The lights blazed on with blinding intensity. Agent Morales stood in the doorway, flanked by 3 federal agents Miguel didn't recognize, their weapons drawn but lowered in a display of controlled menace. Behind them, Warden Vasquez looked like a man attending his own funeral, his face gray with the pallor of complete defeat. "Dr. Rivera, Father Sandoval." Morales's voice carried the satisfaction of a predator who had cornered wounded prey. "I was hoping we wouldn't find you here." Miguel felt his 20 years of ministry dissolving in real time, the stolen documents pressed against his chest like burning coals, each classified page a federal crime that would destroy not just his freedom, but his ability to help anyone ever again. The guards who trusted him, the inmates who sought spiritual guidance, Elena who still believed her brother was simply a humble prison chaplain, all of it crumbling because he had chosen to chase impossible ghosts. "Agents," Miguel said, his voice steadier than he had any right to expect. "I was counseling Dr. Rivera. She's been struggling with the psychological impact of yesterday's incident." Morales stepped into the office, his eyes cataloging every displaced file, every disturbed surface. Counseling. In the warden's office. At 12:30 in the morning. While accessing classified federal documents. Rivera closed her eyes, and Miguel watched her careful composure finally crack. 3 years of documenting supernatural activity, building networks of sympathetic personnel, developing strategies to protect witnesses from psychological evaluation, all of it exposed and worthless. "You were never investigating," she said with hollow realization. "You were hurting us, letting us gather evidence so you could eliminate everyone involved in one coordinated sweep." "Dr. Rivera," Warden Vasquez said quietly, "I'm truly sorry. They gave me no choice." Miguel understood with crystalline horror that Vasquez had been compromised from the beginning, forced to report on any personnel showing excessive interest in supernatural phenomena. Their midnight raid hadn't been discovered. It had been anticipated, facilitated, designed to provide legal justification for their arrest and removal. "The guards who witnessed yesterday's event," Miguel said, "Garcia, Mendoza, the others, are being transferred to different facilities as we speak," Morales replied. "Separated, reassigned, given new responsibilities that will prevent any coordinated testimony about imaginary supernatural encounters." Miguel felt his pastoral responsibilities shattering like glass. The men who had trusted him with impossible experiences were being scattered across Mexico's prison system, isolated and silenced, their sanity questioned, and their careers destroyed. He had failed them as completely as it was possible to fail anyone. "The inmates with supernatural contacts," Rivera said, her scientific curiosity persisting even in defeat. "What happens to them?" Morales smiled with bureaucratic satisfaction. "Relocated to facilities better equipped to manage their particular psychological disturbances. Places where their delusions can be properly treated and contained." The truth struck Miguel like physical violence. The government wasn't just covering up supernatural activity. They were harvesting it, concentrating inmates with spiritual connections in specialized facilities where their abilities could be studied, controlled, and potentially weaponized. Dead cartel leaders weren't manifesting randomly. They were being deliberately summoned by imprisoned associates whose gifts were being exploited by federal researchers. "You're creating supernatural weapons," Miguel whispered, "using the dead as tools of terror and control." "Father Sandoval," Morales said, "you're clearly suffering from the same psychological break affecting other personnel. Fortunately, we have excellent treatment facilities that specialize in trauma-induced paranoid delusions. Miguel realized that his sister Elena would never learn what really happened to him. The official report would describe a mental breakdown brought on by exposure to prison violence, a tragic but understandable collapse requiring long-term psychiatric care in an undisclosed location. His ministry would end not with martyrdom or meaningful sacrifice, but with a bureaucratic diagnosis that would erase his credibility and his ability to testify about anything he had witnessed. Rivera met his eyes across the destroyed office, and Miguel saw his own despair reflected in her face. They had discovered a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, evidence of supernatural phenomena being exploited for political control, proof that the dead could return to influence the living, and none of it mattered because no one would ever believe them. They had lost everything, and their defeat would ensure that countless others would suffer the same fate.